Hello, good morning, friends, seekers, beautiful human beings. It's been a while, I've not uploaded any video, and I have a few minutes before to go to a commitment. So let's dive directly into it. Let's continue on the Tao series, Vible. We left off at chapter 7, I believe. So we can move on to chapter 8 and 9. As usual, I will dive into this classic translation from Taoism.net. And I will then compare or enlighten it through the interpretation of Vian Den Groot in his Vible series on the Tao of Lao-Tzu. So let's start with the classic translation of chapter 8 and 9 of the Tao Te King. So chapter 8. The highest goodness resembles water. Water greatly benefits myriad of things without contention. It stays in places that people dislike. Therefore, it is similar to the Tao, dwelling in the right location, feeling with great depth, giving with great kindness, speaking with great integrity, governing with great administration, handling with great capability, moving with great timing. Because it does not contend, it is therefore beyond reproach. Chapter 9. Holding a cup and overfilling it cannot be as good as stopping short. Pounding a blade and sharpening it cannot be kept for long. Gold and jade fill up the room, no one is able to protect them. Wealth and position bring arrogance and leave disasters upon oneself. When achievement is completed, fame is attained, withdraw oneself. This is the Tao of heaven. So I think chapter 8 has been made famous by Bruce Lee in particular, who would always advocate be like water. He, of course, applied it to his martial art technique of Kung Fu, but he also understood it more deeply as the philosophy of life, a philosophy of not efforting, the Wu way of the Tao Te King. But beyond even the philosophy, there is simply the truth of it. Gravity, water and gravity. Water is it's our best way to understand gravity. And what is gravity other than the pull of God? So let's see Vian Den Groot's interpretation of those chapter 8 and 9. So chapter 8, Vian Den Groot titled it The Supreme Virtue of Water. The subject is formless. One's highest virtue is to behave like water. mindlessly and selflessly benefiting all creatures it irrigates and traverses as life. It effortlessly adopts all and any container's forms, knowing it is formless by nature. It is content dwelling in low places, knowing it will be lifted in season by light. It joyfully races downstream, knowing it is rejoining earth and the ocean, source, by dark. Content in itself, it does not compete nor compare with anyone, yet nourishes all life. Passively active, peacefully powerful, its modesty commands respect. So does the masterful one, compassionately. And number 9, the limitations of separation. Separating one's vessel from contentment. When life adopts the concept of separation, of separate mind containers, of separate bodies of water, one is born, bound to fill the emptiness of forms and objects, and to form the objective of filling the void with a subjective self, subjecting oneself to comparison with other selves, competition of selves, all slaves, to self-judgment, self-alienation, self-destruction, and ultimately, finally, self-realization. The biggest, most bloated and willed vessel will never contain creation. Requiring constant effort and will to avoid spilling will ultimately break away anyway. The sharpest, most wielded knife will never cut itself, requiring constant sharpening to avoid dulling, will ultimately wears out anyway. The richest chest will never content the subjective mind, requiring protection and will to avoid stealing, will ultimately vanishes anyway. The subjective mind generates a multitude of agitation and sufferings, troubling the water of consciousness, subjugating one with the dust and shadows of its polarized concepts. The masterful one is free of trouble, swan not minding the dual dust bound to settle, sipping life directly from the source now. So there's a lot of clarification, but it probably will require a bit of explanation to some of you, to most of you, and to myself. So let's dive into it. The subject is formless. So the subject being the witness of life, one's true identity, the subject. One's highest virtue is to behave like water, mindless, selfless, benefiting all creatures it irrigates and traverses as life. So it traverses all living creature as life permeates all living creatures. It's the concept of helping without interfering, really, that is there in water, and of allowing the universe to move you rather than trying to trace your own path. So it effortlessly adopts all and any container's form. So the water is the content of a container in our day-to-day practical life. And you will see later Vian Den Groot plays on words by using the noun content, and using it also as adjective, content. To be content is to be happy, and to be the content of a container, like a content like water, for example. So, knowing it is formless by nature, which is our true nature too, as consciousness, it is content dwelling in low places. So, when you know yourself as consciousness and infinite and one with all that is, there is no low place anymore. There is no high place or low place. There is only one place. So you are always content, and then you are content whether your projection into this 3D world is dwelling in a low place or not. So it is content. So here is the word play. It is both the content of the container being our vessel, being our body, for example, even our mind. So it is content dwelling in low places, knowing it will be lifted in season by light. So here, Vian Den Groot is both referring to our enlightenment that will ultimately happen in season, but also with the material world where the sunlight evaporates water. It joyfully races downstream. So that's the nature of gravity and of water. Water being a fluid and gravity being what it is. It makes water race downstream, meaning from a higher ground to a lower ground. And here it says joyfully racing downstream. Of course, water, we don't see it as having emotions like joy, but it makes, like a stream flowing down the mountain, makes the sound of a giggling entity. And anyway, what do we know about consciousness? So knowing it is rejoining earth and the ocean source by dark. So we know that water, through gravity, even though it may look like it's racing down to its perdition, it's actually just rejoining the earth itself by gravity. And of course, in the lowest places on the crust of earth, the ocean is found. So the source of water is the ocean. The source of our consciousness is the source. It's the Tao. It's indicible and ineffable. But anyway, content in itself. So water is content in the container. It's also content in its nature. It will not seek to be anything else than water. So it is water, and it doesn't want or need to be anything else. So it does not compete nor compare with anyone. So this sends us back to the first chapters when we were talking of comparison, the pitfalls of comparison in chapter 2. So it does not compete nor compare with anyone, yet nourishes all life. Passively active. So this is also the Wu Wei. Wu Wei is you are passively active, which means your incarnation is active, but you are not identified with it. You are dissociated. You perform it as a natural flow and not as a willful, forceful activity to accomplish some ideology or mental objectives. Peacefully powerful. So there is still action and there is still force, but it's not at the service of an individual will. Its modesty commands respect. So this is also an indication for those who have ambition and who want to be respected and who feel and think that they can obtain respect by force. No, what commands respect is modesty, not force. By force, you can obtain acts of respect, demonstration of respect, but the respect is not felt by the people. To actually command respect deep, it's simply by being yourself, your true nature, passively active and actively passive. So to be actively passive is really the concept of meditation. To be passively active is the concept of action without effort. But both, they merge into a single being, which is the natural being, which is neither passive nor active, neither into action nor inaction. So does the Masterful One compassionately. So here Vian Den Groot introduces the concept of compassion, because we are talking of the supreme virtue of water, and we will see later in the book that the supreme virtue being is actually compassion. So the chapter 9 is a bit more intellectual. It's a bit more practical also for those who are more interested in philosophy of life rather than depth of truth. But it's also very enriching and enlightening, and it helps people realize what they should not be bothering doing, what they should not even try. So the limitations of separation. So the core concept that is causing suffering is the concept of separation. Separating one's vessel, so your incarnation, from contentment. Again, wordplay on the content of a vessel and on contentment. So when life or an incarnate being adopts the concept of separation, of separate mind containers, of separate bodies of water, so there's a lot going on here, because as always, Vian Den Groot speaks on multiple levels simultaneously. So you can read it as a material description of bodies of water. You can read it as bodies of human bodies made mostly of water. You can also extrapolate it to the subject and source and Tao. There are so many interpretations. So to form the objective, so the forms and objects, forming the objective of filling the void with a subjective self. So basically, you are consciousness and you imagine your identity. You then subject yourself to comparison with other perceived selves and start entering into conscious or unconscious competition of selves. All selves being slaves to self-judgment, self-alienation. So this is really the process of ego construction and then of ego solidification and the pain and suffering that it causes and the destruction it causes. But ultimately it always causes self-realization. Once the pain becomes unbearable, it breaks your ego and you free yourself. So the biggest, most bloated and willed vessel. So here we are talking of a human ego with ambition and will, but also a container, the vessel, even the biggest and most distorted vessel will never contain creation. And the will of the human incarnation and the mind of the human incarnation will never comprehend creation. Requiring constant effort and willpower to avoid spilling. When you fill a vessel, if it's filled to the brim and you still want to move, you will spill. Will ultimately break anyway. So the vessel will break anyway if you keep carrying water filled up to the brim. But also this is talking of the willpower of each person, the willpower of the ego that ultimately breaks anyway. That's why the S is in brackets, because the two sentences are there. The vessel despite constant effort to avoid spilling, will ultimately break anyway. And the willpower of an egotistic human being will ultimately, so the will ultimately breaks anyway. And so on and so forth. The sharpest knife will never cut itself, requiring constant sharpening to avoid dulling, will ultimately wear out anyway. So the knife will wear out anyway, but willpower, ultimately wears out anyway. It's ineluctable. It's unavoidable. Same thing with the richest chest that will never content the subjective mind. It will never satisfy the subjective mind, even though there's also a word play here. The content of the chest will never be satisfying. Requiring protection and will to avoid stealing. This will come back later when we talk about more laws, more criminals. So there is no way to accumulate wealth and riches without generating a risk or even a temptation or an unavoidable attempt by people to steal. Not that they are bad, but simply because you have created this differential of value. The subjective mind generates a multitude of agitation and sufferings. So we saw some examples. Troubling the water of consciousness. So we come back to water. Consciousness is often it is often used in spiritual teachings. The use of water as an allegory for consciousness, or also for people generally as a crowd. So subjugating one with the dust and shadows of its polarized concepts. So the concepts are polarizing. It's adopting concepts that mesmerizes you when you are subjugated with the dust and shadows, the smoke and mirrors of creation. So the masterful one is free of trouble. He's not troubled waters. He's a still water. But he's also a swan. Swan not minding the dual dust bound to settle. So there's patience, knowing that the dust will settle. But there is also the concept of not minding both as not being bothered, but also not activating your mind, because the mind is what will trouble the dust. Sipping life directly from the source now. So the swan is an animal that is famous for its ability to drink very muddied water. It has some hair in its beak that allows it to actually filter out the mud from the water while drinking it. So this is the quality of the swan, apart from its beautiful grace. So you see, it's extremely dense and rich. There's a lot to learn and to understand and to digest and to integrate. But also, simply, all these things are only pointing to the simplicity of just being like water, mindless, content, just being genuinely what you are. So, small tip, you are consciousness only. And all what you think you are is just some fantasy interpretation of what your senses are mirroring back to you of yourself. And you don't need to think about it. You don't need to extrapolate, speculate, or even simply identify. Simply look. What needs to be thought of this? Nothing. Just enjoy it. Just be in love with life. That's all there is. Nothing else is needed. Nothing else exists, actually. You are just daydreaming and inventing stories and narratives and concepts and names. We are, even though I quit that bad habit some time ago. So, sayonara, hasta la vista, bye-bye. See you in the next video, if there is one. Bye-bye.